The president's pick is expected to face a challenging confirmation process in the Senate. Republicans currently hold 51 seats in the Senate. They'll need all of those votes to confirm the nominee. GOP leaders are hoping some Democrats will help them clear the 51-vote hurdle. To do that, they're focusing on Democrats from red states, like Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, and Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana. But there is a concern that some Republicans could break from the party. Senators Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska have both said their votes will depend on the nominee's stance on whether to overturn Roe v. Wade. Back with me now are CBS News contributor and Republican strategist Leslie Sanchez, CBSN political contributor and political reporter for The Guardian Sabrina Siddiqui, and CBSN political contributor and national political reporter for Real Clear Politics, Caitlin Huey-Burns. And joining us from Washington is Democratic strategist Joel Payne. Welcome to you all. Caitlin, let me start with you. What do we know about the frontrunners and the president's decision-making process up to this point?
Well, we know from various reports that the president didn't make up his mind until today. Yesterday, he was talking about that he had it narrowed down to about 4 candidates, all of whom he said would be great and should be easily confirmable. He has certainly been playing this out as a reality show-esque kind of ordeal and really kind of enjoying this whole process. This is a very important moment for him. He has said as much. He says that this is the most important thing a president can do aside from war and some other issues. And so he is taking this opportunity to really make a thing of it. And he ultimately hopes that this is something that will be really critical to his own legacy, given the ages of many of these folks you see on the screen. This person will likely serve in this position for a generation. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of activism on all sides of this issue, a lot of lobbying, a lot of jockeying, and we'll know about in a half hour or so. There are lots of camera crews and other reporters kind of staked out of everybody's homes and watching movement there.
Sabrina, remind us who some of the voices that have influenced the president when it comes to this process have been. Who have been some of the key sort of advisors?
Well, he's cast a wide net, and it includes some of the aides at the White House, some of the people that you would expect, like Chief of Staff Jon Kyl and Stephen Miller, who is, of course, a policy advisor. But then he also was golfing over the weekend with Sean Hannity. He has, of course, some of the prominent conservatives who often have his ear. There are some of the Trump loyalists he often speaks to as well. He's also consulted with Republicans on Capitol Hill. Ultimately, they will be the ones who hold the keys to the confirmation process. So Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has had conversations with the president around the nomination and also has been part of at least recommending some of the names from the short list or giving his opinion on whether or not they would face a contentious confirmation battle ahead. Some, of course, are more controversial than others. I think most interestingly, there is Thomas Hardiman, who's emerging as one of the 2 front runners, and that's someone who is recommended by President Trump's own sister, who serves in federal court with Hardiman or has served with him. So, you know, he's someone who does rely a lot on his family. Whether or not that has any bearing on the process here remains to be seen. But he's had a pretty interesting mix of both establishment picks as well as reliably conservative justices, or judges, I should say, who could, of course, be part of cementing this conservative-leaning Supreme Court for decades to come.
Leslie, when you look at the contenders, is there a message already being sent to Republicans as we look to see who it is the president will ultimately pick? But when you look at these, the 4 candidates who've already gotten so much attention, based on their sort of judicial philosophies, what is it that Republicans are taking away from that?
That the president that they were correct to vote for the president in 2016. That's the bottom line when it comes to them. The president is delivering on a promise that was critical to ensuring that base Republicans turned out. He already had this kind of new growing movement of conservative Democrats you had the the evangelicals who were involved, but base Republicans were thinking about sitting on their hands, and this was the agreement that was made. So any of these candidates are looking very strong. There's an interesting thing I keep looking at with Hardiman is that he did some of his pro bono work for Ayuda, which was a Spanish-speaking kind of legal support effort for political asylum.
He speaks Spanish.
And he speaks Spanish, and he felt it was one of the most compelling things of his entire career. So it's going to be interesting as they now, in light of all of the asylum issues, and mostly he has tended to side with the state, but that will be one of the nuances, I think, that gives him a compassionate heart, which I think a lot of people will be looking for.
And Leslie, when you consider the confirmation process and what is expected to be a tough confirmation fight, what do you think it is that Republican lawmakers are going to be hoping for in a nominee?
They're really going to look at how does he interpret the Constitution. Is he going to be someone who's really kind of, does he believe it's a live, living document, or is he going to be more kind of traditional in his approach? And does he follow precedents in that? And you have some of these jurists pushing back on labels in terms of how they see themselves as an originalist, or how they interpret these things. They don't necessarily want to be put in a label or in a box. That makes the Senate very nervous when that happens. But I think there's enough precedents here that you can look at their decisions and how they think to make a critical and accurate observation.
Joel, what about Democrats? Is there any incentive at all here for Democrats to support a nominee, or is this an instance where Democrats are just going to oppose whomever it is that the president chooses?
It depends who you are. If you're Heidi Heitkamp or you're Joe Manchin or you're Joe Donnelly, you do have an incentive to at least listen to who the president nominates and figure out whether your folks back at home will either allow you to question or push back on the president's nominee, or whether you're going to be compelled to support this nominee, even if the Democratic base is after you. If you are a Democrat like Dianne Feinstein, who was essentially primaried in California, you have all the pressure coming from the other end of people who are telling you, do not engage. This is a stolen seat. This is a seat that's ill-begotten by Republicans that Mitch McConnell famously stalled from Merrick Garland. And you have every incentive in the world to not cooperate with whomever President Trump nominates. I thought it was interesting earlier today, Bob Casey already came out, Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, and said he did not support the nominee just off the top. And I actually think strategically that's very smart because that takes him off the griddle, whoever the nominee is, right? You could be boxed in if it's somebody who represents, Hardeman is, I believe, from Pennsylvania, I believe. And so that kind of created some difficult home state politics for him. He went ahead and just took that issue right off the table. So I think it depends who you are in that Democratic caucus.
Sabrina, what's the political reality here, though, for Democrats? I mean, is there anything that Democrats can do realistically to stop or block a nominee's confirmation?
I think the truth is there aren't a lot of tools at their disposal just because they are ultimately in the minority. And after the rules change during the confirmation process for Neil Gorsuch, Republicans, of course, can confirm a Supreme Court nominee with a simple majority vote. So the key for Democrats is going to be to apply a great deal of pressure, not just on those vulnerable Democrats within their own caucus, but on the swing votes within the Republican caucus as well. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, some of the senators who've expressed some reservations about Roe v. Wade, for example. The Democrats are really going to have to make this nominee so objectionable that Republicans are unable to hold the line, and perhaps they could at best sink the president's nominee. It's going to be, of course, an uphill battle, but because it's a midterm election year, they do feel that this is different from the confirmation fight for Neil Gorsuch, who ultimately reaffirmed the balance of the court. Of course, he was replacing the late Antonin Scalia. This is someone who is going to dramatically change the Supreme Court for future generations to come. I think that's the message you're going to hear a lot more from Democrats, and you're going to see them driving home really on issues like access to abortion, immigration, health care. It was interesting, Joe Manchin, one of those vulnerable Democrats who was invited to the White House, he pointed to pre-existing conditions, coverage of pre-existing conditions as something that he's going to ask about, which was alluding to the importance of Obamacare and that this justice would perhaps be more willing to uphold President Obama's health care law. So a lot of it's going to be more campaign issues than it will be tools and tactics in the Senate.
That's interesting. Joel, let me ask you, what do you do if you are a, Joe Manchin, Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Donnelly? What's the best strategy for Democrats in the red states?
Well, I think you wait. I think you wait to see what's going to happen with Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski, because essentially, if those two Republican senators don't cross over, Republicans can just hold the line, and even if Democrats hold serve, Republicans can get this nominee through. But if you have defections like that from the Republican caucus, it does create a bit of a crisis for some of those folks that we're talking about, the Joe Manchins, the Joe Donnellys, and the Heidi Heitkamps of the world. So I think you wait. I think you see what some of the response is from the Republican side, and I think you make a decision based on that. I will say I noticed what Sabrina noticed as well. Democrats are making this about health care. They're also making the framing here about big corporations versus working class people. Whose side are you on? So they're essentially trying to turn this into an election day issue for November.
Leslie, let me ask you about what we expect will be a tough confirmation fight. Does that actually ultimately help Republicans in the midterms?
It depends who they're fighting. Are they fighting Republicans within the Republicans, and conservatives are battling against each other? We like to kill our own. That's not going to definitely help anybody. I don't think you're going to see that. I think the benefit of this is you do have kind of consensus conservative jurists that people can fundamentally get behind, even though they know it's not perfect. It's like an umbrella. It does give you cover for most things, that people can accept that. What's interesting about all that is the Democrats are trying to make this an issue on abortion and Roe v. Wade. Somebody like Hardiman doesn't really have a big, strong position. So if the president can neutralize that with McConnell and give some assurance that that's not what this is going to be about. It's not about changing precedents on this. I do believe it's very impactful in neutralizing the Democratic argument all across the board.
Caitlin, let me ask you, how intense do you think that pressure will be? Going back to the Democrats for a moment, who are in those red states. We've already seen them decline to be there at the White House's invitation for the announcement tonight. All three of the Democrats that we've just been talking about declined those invitations. How much political pressure do you think those Democrats in red states will be facing?
It's going to be very intense, and we've already seen their Republican challengers making this an issue in their campaigns. You're talking about Indiana, West Virginia, and North Dakota. Those are where Democrats, of course, are up for re-election in states Trump won overwhelmingly, and those are also Democrats that did cross the aisle last time and vote for Gorsuch. The difference, though, is, because as we've been talking about, this is a seat that could potentially change the balance of power or the ideological makeup of the court. So this is a much more difficult decision for these lawmakers to make. And Democrats really have to kind of weigh two things here. One is the idea that the Democratic base is so energized by being against anything that Trump is for, but also really energized on key issues like health care, access to abortion, voting rights, some other things that are really animating that base, balanced with the idea that as a red state Democrat, particularly in a state that Trump won overwhelmingly, you don't really have the luxury of depending just on that Democratic base. You have to get some Republicans, and of course you have to get those independents. So if you have the Republicans on the other side making this an issue and putting money behind making this an issue in campaigns, I think it makes it very difficult. You also have to look at the timeline that we're talking about. A vote probably happening in September or October. We know this news cycle moves very fast, so we could be on to other issues come November, but it does place that critical vote in the spotlight, which really ups the ante for a lot of these Democrats.
And Sabrina, Caitlin touched on this, but if you could just underscore for us, how different is this particular pick from Neil Gorsuch's pick?
It's dramatically different, and as Caitlin said, and we've talked about, this is not someone who's ultimately reaffirming the balance of the court as it currently exists. You are losing in Anthony Kennedy, someone who has been a pivotal swing vote on issues that include access to abortion, LGBT rights, of course. I think that Chief Justice John Roberts is someone who has sometimes angered conservatives, most infamously when he voted to uphold, the heart of Obamacare. But for the most part, I think what you're going to see is a conservative, decidedly conservative balance within the Supreme Court. And that's why Democrats do believe that they do perhaps have more persuasion, at least in the eyes of the public, when it comes to the battle that is looming ahead, because they could elevate some of these issues and make this a lot more about a decisive question as to what the future of America will look like on issues that also include affirmative action, voting rights. There's a whole host of issues, of course, that are before the court. The travel ban most recently was another big ruling where you saw the impact of Anthony Kennedy still being there, but you still saw the impact of what could be, of course, a future court looking at a similar case and perhaps having more far-reaching consequences. So that's really what this is about.
Leslie, we know that once the pick is announced, that former Arizona Senator Jon Kyl is going to be the quote-unquote Sherpa, who essentially guides the nominee through that process and basically goes to those meetings on Capitol Hill, helps them through that process. What do you think the strategy was in choosing Jon Kyl?
Oh, it's somebody obviously who has a tremendous amount of experience on the Senate Judiciary Committee, having overseen it, but also understood hundreds of individuals who've moved through the failed and the successful attempts to move through there. He knows the staff, he knows where the pitfalls are, political landmines, so to speak. I wanted to add also to one thing Sabrina said, and also one of the big issues is going to be religious freedoms. That comes up consistently, and it's come up now, and how that is going to be an issue that galvanizes the base. But it's understanding the pain points of all those members, what's going to be important to them, the nuance, and that's basically getting that nominee up to speed extremely quickly with the cliff notes, so to speak, of how to excel, and succeed with each individual senator.
All right. As you've been speaking, Leslie, we've been watching outside the Supreme Court. There you see protesters demonstrating. I'm reading the signs there. Don't criminalize abortion. Some of those signs say, we the people. I see signs for reproductive freedom. So we are going to continue to monitor, obviously. There you see another sign, Protect Roe. We're going to continue to monitor what is taking place there as we wait for President Trump to announce that pick in just about less than 15 minutes or so. We're expecting that to take place. Leslie, Sabrina, Caitlin, and Joel, my thanks to you all. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins me now from Washington. So, Ed, what is it that you're hearing, if anything, about who the president's frontrunner may be?
Well, as our colleague Jan Crawford, who covers the court closely, reported earlier, everything appears to be leaning towards Brett Kavanaugh, this former George W. Bush staff secretary, former Justice Department official who serves on the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, or the circuit in D.C., a court that has produced many other Supreme Court justices in the past. In the last few days, we know the president's been reviewing the names of 4 potential nominees. Again, all signs at this hour, at least if you believe, and we should, the reporting of our colleague Jan Crawford and others, it looks as if it may be Judge Kavanaugh. But this is a president who has managed today at least to keep a pretty good secret, or if people in town know, they haven't revealed who exactly it is. And so we'll just have to wait and see here. And the White House, hoping in many ways to replicate the drama, the suspense that surrounded the announcement of Neil Gorsuch last year, hoping that they can do it again this year with this announcement tonight in the East Room.
As we continue to watch Washington, there you see inside the East Room where people are gathering now as we await President Trump and his announcement of his pick for Supreme Court nominee. Ed, let me ask you, when it comes to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, as you look at those 4 contenders, is there a sense among Republican lawmakers in particular that they've already secured a victory here?
No, because there is concern about the possibility that 1, 2, maybe as many as 3 Republican senators would have some concern with whoever it is the president picks. A lot of the focus right now, of course, is on Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, John McCain of Arizona, should he be able to come to Washington and vote. But there could be some other unforeseen issue or circumstance that might compel another Republican senator potentially to oppose the pick. Otherwise, as many Democrats have pointed out, it's essentially the Republicans' game or nomination to lose, because Democrats basically are completely hamstrung, unable to do anything really to stop this from happening, other than to put pressure on at least 1 Republican, maybe 2, for whatever reason, to vote no.
And Ed, what kind of reaction will we expect to see from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle once this pick is announced?
Well, one of the genius things about the White House's decision to unveil the nominee, however it is the president does it here tonight, is that they have invited a handful of what we believe to be only Republican senators to be in the East Room tonight for the announcement. The genius in that, from a communications perspective, is that they will then run to the cameras in the room and start to immediately sort of convey why they think this person is a brilliant pick and why it's someone that the Senate should quickly move to confirm and put on the court. That's a sort of a newer way of doing this. And we're going to see this nominee, we're told, tomorrow at the Capitol, beginning to make their rounds to meet with Senate Majority Leader McConnell and other senators and really start to hit the ground running. Republicans have been pointing out that the average time between the announcement of a nominee and their confirmation is 107 days. That is a timeline that they believe they can fulfill in this case in hopes of getting the new nominee, the new justice, on the bench by the first Monday of October when the Supreme Court reconvenes.
And Ed, I wonder, we've been talking about how obviously the dynamic now is different compared to when it was Neil Gorsuch who was chosen, considering that, as we've been talking about here in New York, this pick is expected to move the court more solidly to the right. I wonder if that's sort of a palpable feeling that you're sensing as well in Washington, because those stakes are higher, some have argued, with this Supreme Court pick.
Sure, and that is the way people read it here, if the president is indeed working off this list of 4 justices that has been talked about now for about 3 days, because all of them essentially have a record that suggests they are conservative justices in the mold of Antonin Scalia or Neil Gorsuch or Samuel Alito, and that there aren't any surprises necessarily or reason to doubt that they would rule in favor of the conservative legal viewpoints. And so that is what sort of feeds this inevitability for Republicans and this dread for Democrats and liberals who are concerned about what could transpire in the coming years should this person get on the bench and it perhaps begin to tilt more to the right. But of course, the one thing to remember is once somebody's on the court, there's no guarantee they're going to vote a certain way. Remember, a lot of conservatives are still upset with Chief Justice Roberts for the way he sided with the liberal justices to essentially uphold most of the Affordable Care Act a few years ago. Ever since then, and then candidate Trump even campaigned, vowing to put justices on the court who wouldn't do what Roberts did. And so if this person proves to be the conservative that many Republicans are hoping for, then it will be seen as a big success.
Ed, I wonder what you've been hearing. We've been talking here in New York about the political pressure on those Democrats in red states and how I know you've talked to the offices of several of those Democrats there. You see, by the way, Vice President Mike Pence, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in the East Room now. I believe Senator Grassley is behind there. But what have you been hearing, Ed, about what it is that they're facing here as they try to figure out a strategy to navigate this particular issue?
I got on the phone with Democratic aides today, Elaine, and to a person, the phone conversation began with some kind of a sigh from them because they know what's coming here. It's going to be an intense amount of pressure applied from here in Washington and back home, especially on the airwaves, but also among grassroots groups who are going to be pushing for their Democratic senator who's up for re-election this year to face, or to support whoever it is the president nominates. But look, you talk to Democrats, especially, and they say, we don't necessarily see evidence right now that how Democratic senators and Republican senators vote on the Supreme Court is going to be as big a motivating factor as general concerns about health care, the tax reform plan, the continued questions about the legal issues surrounding the White House. You turn around and say, well, look, all of those issues could come before the court in the next few years. And they say, yes, of course, but what's going to drive people out is not that somebody has been nominated or not, whether or not they've been confirmed. It's all these other, as they kept saying, kitchen table issues that they believe will drive turnout. And I think beyond sort of the most rabid of base voters on either side, is there really going to be any motivation around this? Unless, of course, we're sitting here in late October, right before Election Day, and the Senate still hasn't voted on this person, and a vote is held. Could it be a last-minute wedge issue or motivating factor? Perhaps.
Ed, there we see the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, among those who have gathered there in the East Room. And I wonder, Ed, if I could just get your thoughts, because among those lawmakers as well that you mentioned, those Republican lawmakers who were invited, there we see Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona. Remind our viewers, Ed, what has been the relationship between this White House and that senator?
There's a reason Jeff Flake shows up for this. While they've had disagreements over tone and temperament, their opinions on John McCain and trade issues, the one area where Jeff Flake has always been in near lockstep with the president and the White House is on judicial appointments. He has told me and others here at CBS repeatedly how pleased he's been with the White House's management of judicial appointments, getting them up to the Senate, getting the Senate to confirm them, and picking people who he believes are sufficiently conservative and qualified to be on the bench. He was thrilled with the Neil Gorsuch decision last year, in part because Gorsuch actually hails from the West and is not somebody who resides or studied or was born east of the Mississippi. That probably won't be the case tonight, as the four names that we know are in the mix are all from either the Central Time Zone or the Eastern Time Zone. But Flake, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, has been quite pleased with how the administration has handled judicial appointments, and that's one of the reasons why he's there tonight.
And Ed, in this midterm election year, as we continue to see lawmakers and dignitaries file into the East Room, there's Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. How galvanizing an issue do you think this Supreme Court pick will be for Republicans this midterm election year?
Absolutely galvanizing, because you will very quickly see the entire sort of Republican and conservative political establishment close ranks behind whoever this nominee is and push to ensure that this person is swiftly confirmed. Whether people turn out in November to thank the president and Senate Republicans for getting this person onto the court, if it's done by Election Day, remains to be seen. But you better believe that in the coming hours, this person will very quickly become a well-known name among conservatives in this country who support the president, Republicans who are concerned about the balance of the court. And let's remember, back in 2016, roughly 20% of voters said in the exit polls that one of the reasons they turned out and voted for Donald Trump was out of concern over the future of the ideological balance of the Supreme Court. That was the highest that the Supreme Court had ever measured in sort of issues of concern on a presidential election day. For the last 3 weeks of the campaign, Donald Trump traveled the country saying, you may not like me personally, but you know that I'm going to appoint somebody far more conservative than Hillary Clinton ever would. And the exit polling showed in the end that that actually was a factor, a motivating factor for many Republicans, conservatives, or right-leaning independents who showed up to vote for him on Election Day.
All right, Ed O'Keefe in Washington for us. Ed, thank you very much. Whomever President Trump picks as his Supreme Court nominee will have a lasting impact on the interpretation of U.S. law for decades to come. The four leading candidates have several similarities. They're all appellate judges, are under the age of 53, and are considered to be right of center politically. But they also have plenty of differences between them. Joining me now to discuss is Jesse Weber, attorney and host at the Law and Crime Network. We'll also have Ilya Shapiro joining us in a moment. But Jesse, we only have a couple minutes left. But of course, one of the biggest topics in Washington after Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement was what the future of Roe versus Wade would be. Help me understand the dynamic here with these picks. Was there one nominee or one potential nominee in particular that stood out in terms of being particularly forceful against abortion rights?
I'm so happy you brought this up. Everybody considers that a majority conservative court automatically means Roe v. Wade will be overturned. Now, if you look at all of the nominees, no one has made an explicit statement saying that I'm going to overturn this. When you look at Amy Barrett, though, she has made it very clear that she looks at precedent a little bit differently when I'm talking about his Supreme Court decisions. She is, how should I say this, not so restricted in the way of following Supreme Court precedent. She said she might overturn that. Doesn't necessarily mean she's talking about Roe v. Wade, but it does give the idea, and remember, that case was decided on a right of privacy grounds, and she has said that the Constitution doesn't expressly protect that right. So if I'm interpreting her as she would be interpreting the Constitution, people could look at her and say she might be a threat to Roe v. Wade. Just to take a step back, though, no matter who is nominated, it's not that simple to get that overturned. It is a long process. You need the right case. You need it to go through the court system. The Supreme Court eventually has to take it up, and they have to decide it on a specific issue. Now, again, when you talk about a majority Supreme Court, yes, that's the conversation.
All right, Jesse, thank you so much. We are going to take you now to a CBS News special report. The president is about to announce his pick for the Supreme Court.
At a special time at 10/9 Central, CBS Tonight.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Jeff Glor reporting from Washington tonight, and the suspense and speculation is coming to an end. President Trump is about to introduce his nominee to replace retiring Justice Anthony Kennedy on the Supreme Court. This will be Mr. Trump's second appointment after Neil Gorsuch, as the president shapes the nation's highest court for years to come. He'll be making this announcement and making the introduction in the East Room of the White House. You're looking at that right now in anticipation of this. Protesters have gathered outside the Supreme Court building a couple miles away, protesting on both sides of the Roe v. Wade issue. Jan Crawford is our chief legal correspondent. She covers the Supreme Court for us. Margaret Brenner, of course, is the moderator of Face the Nation. Welcome to both of you. Jan, what are you looking for here?
Well, I mean, what I'm looking for is in those images that we were just seeing, who's in that room. Of course, from the very beginning, Judge Brett Kavanaugh has been the front runner, and a good clue is his parents have been spotted in the room, as well as several of his friends and associates. The president likes to keep things dramatic, and certainly he's keeping this close until the very end. But Judge Kavanaugh would be a solid conservative pick. Conservatives would be very happy with this. He's a highly regarded federal appeals court judge here on the prestigious D.C. Circuit.
Brett Kavanaugh, 53 years old, as you said, works here in Washington, D.C., and now widely expected to be the pick. Let's watch and listen to the president.
My fellow Americans, tonight I speak to you from the East Room of the White House regarding one of the most profound responsibilities of the President of the United States, and that is the selection of a Supreme Court justice. I've often heard that other than matters of war and peace, this is the most important decision a president will make. The Supreme Court is entrusted with the safeguarding of the crown jewel of our republic, the Constitution of the United States. 12 days ago, Justice Anthony Kennedy informed me of his decision to take senior status on the Supreme Court, opening a new vacancy. For more than 4 decades, Justice Kennedy served our nation with incredible passion and devotion. I'd like to thank Justice Kennedy for a lifetime of distinguished service. In a few moments, I will announce my selection for Justice Kennedy's replacement. This is the second time I have been faced with this task. Last year, I nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to replace the late, great Justice Antonin Scalia. I chose Justice Gorsuch because I knew that he, just like Justice Scalia, would be a faithful servant of our Constitution. we are honored to be joined tonight by Justice Scalia's beloved wife, Maureen. Maureen? Thank you, Maureen. Both Justice Kennedy and Justice Scalia were appointed by a president who understood that the best defense of our liberty and a judicial branch immune from political prejudice were judges that apply the Constitution as written. That president happened to be Ronald Reagan. For this evening's announcement, we are joined by Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, Edwin Meese. Ed? And Ed, I speak for everyone. Thank you for everything you've done to protect our nation's great legal heritage. In keeping with President Reagan's legacy, I do not ask about a nominee's personal opinions. What matters is not a judge's political views, but whether they can set aside those views to do what the law and the Constitution require. I am pleased to say that I have found, without doubt, such a person. Tonight, it is my honor and privilege to announce that I will nominate Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. I know the people in this room very well. They do not stand and give applause like that very often, so they have some respect. And Brett's wife, Ashley, and their two daughters, Margaret and Liza, have joined us on the podium, and thank you and congratulations to you as a family. Thank you. Judge Kavanaugh has impeccable credentials, unsurpassed qualifications, and a proven commitment to equal justice under the law. A graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, Judge Kavanaugh currently teaches at Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown. Throughout legal circles, he is considered a judge's judge, a true thought leader among his peers. He is a brilliant jurist with a clear and effective writing style, universally regarded as one of the finest and sharpest legal minds of our time. And just like Justice Gorsuch, he excelled as a clerk for Justice Kennedy. That's great. Thank you. Yeah. Judge Kavanaugh has devoted his life to public service. For the last 12 years, he has served as a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals with great distinction, authoring over 300 opinions which have been widely admired for their skill, insight, and rigorous adherence to the law. Among those opinions are more than a dozen that the Supreme Court has adopted as the law of the land. Beyond his great renown as a judge, he is active in his community. He coaches CYO basketball, serves meals to needy families, and, having learned from his mom, who is a school teacher in D.C., tutors children at local elementary schools. There is no one in America more qualified for this position and no one more deserving. I want to thank the senators on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, for their consultation and advice during the selection process. This incredibly qualified nominee deserves a swift confirmation and robust bipartisan support. The rule of law is our nation's proud heritage. It is the cornerstone of our freedom. It is what guarantees equal justice. And the Senate now has the chance to protect this glorious heritage by sending Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. And now, Judge, the podium is yours.
Mr. President, thank you. Throughout this process, I've witnessed firsthand your appreciation for the vital role of the American judiciary. No president has ever consulted more widely or talked with more people from more backgrounds to seek input about a Supreme Court nomination. Mr. President, I am grateful to you, and I'm humbled by your confidence in me. Thank you. 30 years ago, President Reagan nominated Anthony Kennedy to the Supreme Court. The framers established that the Constitution is designed to secure the blessings of liberty. Justice Kennedy devoted his career to securing liberty. I am deeply honored to be nominated to fill his seat on the Supreme Court. My mom and dad are here. I am their only child. When people ask what it's like to be an only child, I say, it depends on who your parents are. I was lucky. My mom was a teacher. In the 1960s and 70s, she taught history at two largely African-American public high schools in Washington, D.C., McKinley Tech and H.D. Woodson. Her example taught me the importance of equality for all Americans. My mom was a trailblazer. When I was 10, she went to law school and became a prosecutor. My introduction to law came at our dinner table when she practiced her closing arguments. Her trademark line was, "Use your common sense. What rings true? What rings false?" That's good advice for a juror and for a son. One of the few women prosecutors of that time, she overcame barriers and became a trial judge. The president introduced me tonight as Judge Cavanaugh, but to me, that title always belonged to my mom. My dad went to law school at night while working full-time. He has an unparalleled work ethic and has passed down to me his passion for playing and watching sports. I love him dearly. The motto of my Jesuit high school was "Men for Others." I've tried to live that creed. I've spent my career in public service, from the executive branch and the White House to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. I've served with 17 other judges, each of them a colleague and a friend. My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent. For the past 11 years, I've taught hundreds of students primarily at Harvard Law School. I teach that the Constitution's separation of powers protects individual liberty. And I remain grateful to the dean who hired me, Justice Elaine Quijano. As a judge, I hire 4 law clerks each year. I look for the best. My law clerks come from diverse backgrounds and points of view. I am proud that a majority of my law clerks have been women. I am part of the vibrant Catholic community in the D.C. area. The members of that community disagree about many things, but we are united by a commitment to serve. Father John Ensler is here. 40 years ago, I was an altar boy for Father John. These days, I help him serve meals to the homeless at Catholic Charities. I have 2 spirited daughters, Margaret and Liza. Margaret loves sports, and she loves to read. Liza loves sports, and she loves to talk. I have tried to create bonds with my daughters like my dad created with me. For the past 7 years, I have coached my daughters' basketball teams. The girls on the team call me Coach K. I am proud of our Blessed Sacrament team that just won the city championship. My daughters and I also go to lots of games. Our favorite memory was going to the historic Notre Dame-UConn women's basketball game at this year's Final Four. Unforgettable. My wife, Ashley, is a West Texan, a graduate of Abilene Cooper Public High School and the University of Texas. She is now the town manager of our community. We met in 2001 when we both worked in the White House. Our first date was on September 10th, 2001. The next morning, I was a few steps behind her as the Secret Service shouted at all of us to sprint out the front gates of the White House because there was an inbound plane. In the difficult weeks that followed, Ashley was a source of strength for President Bush and for everyone in this building. Through bad days and so many better days since then, she has been a great wife and an inspiring mom. I thank God every day for my family. Tomorrow, I begin meeting with members of the Senate, which plays an essential role in this process. I will tell each senator that I revere the Constitution. I believe that an independent judiciary is the crown jewel of our constitutional republic. If confirmed by the Senate, I will keep an open mind in every case. And I will always strive to preserve the Constitution of the United States and the American rule of law. Thank you, Mr. President.
So there you go. It is Brett Kavanaugh there with his two daughters and his wife as he walks away following the president. And Brett Kavanaugh looking out at his parents in the audience. One can only imagine what's going through their minds at a moment like this. Jan, as we watch everyone wrap up here, Jan Crawford back with us now, as well as Margaret Brennan. What does this pick tell you, Jan?
Well, I mean, I think this pick shows that this is a president who was not going to pull any punches. He was going to have a fight to get a nominee that he believed was going to be a conservative intellectual force on the Supreme Court, and he is going to take that fight right to the Democrats who certainly opposed him for his appellate court nomination. Because
Kavanaugh has a record, and they're going to have to go through that, because it could be this fight now.
Absolutely, but the president is saying, I'm willing to do it. I'm going to, make the Supreme Court. I campaigned on this, and I am delivering. And there's no question, I mean, with this nomination, President Trump may well do what Republican presidents have tried to do for 40 years and failed, and that is to turn the Supreme Court into a more clearly, solidly conservative direction and away from what they see as the real excesses of the Warren Court. I mean, this is a generational pick that could affect generations to come.
And because appointees have so often disappointed Republican presidents. And
Absolutely, and there was pressure on the president to maybe play it safe, to go with someone who didn't have a record, who didn't have a paper trail, and I think with this pick, he says, no, bring it.
Margaret, talk about the nomination process and what's ahead here.
There is very little Democrats can do to stop the swing of the court, as Jan laid out, towards more conservative leanings here. Because the Republican majority is such a slim, razor-thin margin, really any one senator crossing over could make or break this nominee. And so that is why the politicking of this is going to get going tomorrow. The vice president will escort Kavanaugh to the Hill, take him around, make the introductions. They're going to be focusing on winning over some of these red state Democrats to try to get this confirmation in place by early October, ahead of those congressional races. And it's interesting to see the president embrace someone who is so close to the Bush family. We are seeing such a warm reception from them, from the establishment Republicans, from a president who promised to upend the establishment when he came here.
The Supreme Court is going to be huge talk on the campaign trail here before midterms coming up on both sides. Margaret Brennan, Jan Crawford, thanks to both of you. So President Trump here nominates Brett Kavanaugh to be the 114th Justice of the United States Supreme Court. There will be much more about this on your late local news on this CBS station, on our 24-hour streaming news service CBSN, and for some of you in the West on the CBS Evening News. Also tomorrow, CBS This Morning will have the only network interview with Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer reacting to this nomination. For now, I'm Jeff Glor, CBS News in Washington. For many of you, CBS primetime programming will continue in just a moment.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. Welcome back to CBSN's special coverage of President Trump's Supreme Court pick. Brett Kavanaugh has been nominated to the highest court in the land. The 53-year-old is currently a conservative federal appeals judge. Kavanaugh will require Senate confirmation before he's able to take his seat on the bench. Earlier, the president said he was confident about his nominee.
What matters is not a judge's political views, but whether they can set aside those views to do what the law and the Constitution require. I am pleased to say that I have found, without doubt, such a person. Tonight, it is my honor and privilege to announce that I will nominate Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court.
Ilya Shapiro joins us now from Washington. Ilya is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. All right, Ilya, first of all, what is your take on this selection of Judge Kavanaugh?
Well, he was considered to be the front runner the whole time. He had essentially the inside the beltway legal elites, conservative legal elites behind him. His clerks were out in force, and it worked. He was the favorite of Don McGahn, the White House counsel, a leading candidate all the way through. He did not make the first list that Trump put out, or the second one. He was added in November, but certainly a very strong reputation for conservative, structural literal, textualist, originalist opinions enforcing the separation of powers, and pushing back on the administrative law, meaning on executive agencies. That's what he's known for in the D.C. Circuit, which is the what's considered to be the AAA, the second most prestigious court in the land that handles appeals from government agencies.
Well, Ilya, what do we know with this now presumed, what we assume to be a confirmation fight that's going to be a difficult fight? What do we know about his particular judicial philosophy based on the decisions that he's made so far that could be a focal point for Democrats?
Well, both his decisions and his speeches and writings. He publishes about an average of one law review article a year, and he does have a big public profile. That's part of the reason why he's attracted a big following. And I don't know if anything in his cases necessarily is going to what's going to attract smears or attacks or what have you. In fact, whoever it was going to be, there was going to be a big opposition. They had those signs protesting outside the Supreme Court with a blank space that I guess they're now all trying to write in Kavanaugh, and hopefully they spell it correctly. Probably his service in the Bush White House will attract more opposition and attacks than necessarily any of his opinions. He doesn't have any four-square culture war opinions on gay marriage or anything like that. On guns, he's pretty strong in defending the right to keep and bear arms, but not anything crazy like approving machine guns or having no restrictions whatsoever. So he'll be questioned on lots of things, and especially Roe v. Wade seems to be brought up even more than has been in the past. So look for that at his hearings. But he doesn't have any red flags that way, and I doubt he's the sort of person that Susan Collins, who's the focal point, the most moderate Republican, would object to. And that means even though the Republican majority is narrow, very narrow, given no filibuster, he should be confirmed.
Remind us, though, there had been some conservatives who felt that Brett Kavanaugh was not sufficiently conservative, that he wasn't conservative enough. Why was that? What was their argument?
Well, I share a certain concern that he's too much like John Roberts, not enough like a Gorsuch or a Thomas, which isn't to say that he's a secret left-winger or a squishy moderate, nothing like that. But there are different views, not just of originalism or textualism, how you interpret the Constitution, but the proper mode of a judge, the proper role. How restrained are you? Do you try to make narrow decisions or broader ones? And Kavanaugh has a reputation for being very shrewd in terms of how he's deciding these cases, not necessarily with an agenda to overrule large swaths of precedent. I don't think it's enough for conservatives to come out and start attacking him, or libertarians or populists or whoever else might otherwise be inclined to support a nominee. So I think you're going to see more attacks from the left. It doesn't mean that everybody, all conservatives or Republicans or Trump supporters are necessarily going to be ecstatic with him. Different people had different favorites, but I don't think he raises the kind of red flags that happened under, say, Harriet Miers when she was withdrawn, or other people that have been criticized harshly.
You mentioned, in speaking of Brett Kavanaugh, this term being a textualist. First of all, what is that? And also, if confirmed then, how would Kavanaugh alter the makeup of the court?
Yeah, textualist means that when you're interpreting a law made by Congress or a state legislature, you look at the text and you use various interpretive techniques. What does that law mean in the context of the greater regulatory scheme or what have you? And you don't try to figure out what the legislators might have intended to do by looking at committee reports or, well, the real purpose is to do X, therefore we can't have a result Y that goes against X. Textualists say, look, if the law says that, I'm going to apply that, even if it results in a result that might not look fair or might not look good, because that's not the role of a judge to correct. That's the role of a legislator. Similarly, originalism is kind of like textualism applied to the Constitution, but here you're interpreting a 200-plus-year-old document rather than a law that might have been passed, very recently. So you're looking at contemporary dictionaries from the late 18th century or the mid-19th century, newspapers, trying to understand what the text of the Constitution, what its original public meaning is. That's what originalism means. Now, where he stands in the new court, he will certainly be to the right, comfortably on the right somewhere. I can't exactly say on different issues, whether closer to Alito or Thomas or Gorsuch, but to the right of John Roberts, the Chief Justice, who will now definitively become, assuming Kavanaugh is confirmed, the median vote. Not the swing vote. He's not going to go back and forth, but he will determine exactly how fast and where the court will go, whether on huge controversial issues or other ones that don't necessarily make the front pages.
Of course, Kavanaugh is President Trump's second Supreme Court nomination, following now Justice Neil Gorsuch. Where are there similarities and differences between the two?
Well, they've both been involved with the Federalist Society. That's not something that John Roberts was a part of, meaning that from a very young age, from law school or a young legal career age, they're aware of this network of conservative and libertarian lawyers and law students who are out to change the legal culture, lawyers being perceived to be on the left in various ways. And he's intellectually steeped in the law. He's known, agree with him or not, as being brilliant, as writing opinions that are scholarly and that are often cited by the Supreme Court, by advocates. He's one of these lower court judges that has presidential authority, persuasive presidential authority beyond simply his court or the courts that are directly below him in D.C. And so, again, this is not someone that's a cipher or that's come out of the woodwork, that's a surprise. Very well known among those who follow legal developments, and maybe he won't excite the base as much as certain other people that were being considered, but at the same time, that means that he doesn't have quite as much opposition. They'll be grasping at certain things. I don't know how much traction that is going to get in the public discourse.
Well, given what we know about Brett Kavanaugh, is it likely or even possible that if, in fact, the issue of upholding or overturning Roe v. Wade were to come before the court, that he would vote to overturn it, Roe v. Wade?
I don't think so, because that issue, it would be strange just to have a case that says, is there a right to abortion? Typically, you would have various kinds of restrictions. The court faces abortion cases every 5 years or so. And what you'll see, I think, and this is especially, as I mentioned, to be led by the Chief Justice, the median vote, that you will have some of these restrictions starting to be upheld, which would have been struck down with Anthony Kennedy's vote without needing to touch Roe v. Wade or Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And that's the governing standard. We talk about Roe, but Casey, the 1992 case that Kennedy engineered and authored, put in this undue burden standard. So what gets through or what survives an undue burden standard, I think now will expand. But I think we're generally far off from overturning Roe altogether. In other areas of law, it just depends. All this focus on abortion, but for example, racial preferences in education admissions. That's one area where I could see Kavanaugh being the definitive fifth vote, given that Roberts is already on record as saying that they violate the Constitution to get rid of that altogether.
All right, Ilya Shapiro joining us from Washington. Ilya, thanks very much for your perspective. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care.
All right, to discuss some of the political reaction to President Trump's announcement, I want to bring back our panel of Leslie Sanchez, Sabrina Siddiqui, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Joel Payne in Washington. All right, let me first of all go to you, Leslie. This was, in some respects, an obvious choice, some are saying, because for a president who has made it a point to try to keep his promises to the conservative elements of his base, this was a pick that seemed to please, at least from the initial reaction, a lot of those conservatives.
Very big, broad strokes in terms of establishing support among base Republicans, your establishment Republicans, your conservatives. He comes from a court that is a bit of a way station for the Supreme Court. So he'd always been talked about. He was part of the Federalist Society, which we talked about earlier, which is really an incubator for training, credentialing, socializing a new generation of young jurists that can go and eventually lead these courts like we see today. So he has been in the pipeline for a very long time. And there's one thing that I do point to that will come up, is that he was a big architect and writer in the Starr report and outlined 11 grounds for Clinton impeachment, which could be awkward later, but depending how things come out in Congress a few years from now. But it is definitely someone who has a wide range of experience that Republicans are going to favor.
Caitlin, what are some of the challenges you think that Kavanaugh is going to face in the confirmation process?
Well, as we've seen in reporting leading up to this, Cavanaugh is one of the more experienced members of those who were talked about, but that also means that he has a long paper trail. He also worked in the White House, of course, the Bush White House. People are going to have to go through lots and lots of documents and papers and writings and exchanges and pretty much everything this person has said. So there is a lot for people to kind of go through and digest. You're already hearing staunch opposition from Democrats already. Chuck Schumer kind of saying that he's going to fight this tooth and nail to the extent that he can. So he is going to have opposition on that regard. You do see, though, by and large, Republicans really satisfied with this pick, and it raises the question of, you know, what those two Republican senators that we're looking at, Murkowski and Collins, whether this is a pick that is more mainstream in terms of what they're looking for. That could be a factor here. Another thing to consider, too, is that because he was involved in the Starr decision, he has also made comments during that, the Starr case, that a president shouldn't be, you know, have to be involved in, he has presidential powers that kind of could inoculate him from these investigations, which I think you're going to hear questions about that, particularly from senators like Cory Booker, Democrat, who has said that we should not consider a president until consider the president's pick until the Mueller investigation wraps up. Not that that's realistic, but I think that's going to be along the lines of what you're going to hear.
Yeah, what about that, Joel? I mean, the notion that you do have quite the record here for Democrats who are going to try to slow down, presumably, this confirmation process. They have a lot to go through.
They do have a lot to go through. There's quite the paper trail on Judge Kavanaugh. And, you know, I think what you're already seeing is Democrats are wasting no time in laying out the markers here. Chuck Schumer's statement, I think, was out about 10 seconds after Donald Trump said Brett Kavanaugh. And he was very clear what the marker was going to be. It was going to be about women's health. It was going to be about health care. It's going to be about executive privilege. I think also something that Democrats are going to push on here. They're going to talk about a recent opinion that Judge Kavanaugh wrote about a young girl who is held at the border from a migrant family and rights involving that. And I think there's a lot here for Democrats to pick through. I will say this. The president could have gone for a full-on culture war. Picking someone like Amy Coney Barrett, that would have been signaling to his base, I'm ready to fight. This signals I'm ready to fight, but I'm also ready to be somewhat of a governor here. And I think that's interesting. That's interesting signaling to Senate Republicans. I think Mitch McConnell is not as happy as he could be with this choice, but he is happier than he would be with, say, someone like Amy Coney Barrett.
Yeah, let me ask you about that, Sabrina. I mean, the notion that, as Joel points out, there was the potential for, from a strategic point of view, to sort of add fuel to this already very, very heated culture war that's been taking place. And so that, in some respects, some Republicans, I imagine, must be breathing a sigh of relief.
Absolutely. I think that the president has really given a pass to Republicans in the Senate by handing them a longtime Washington insider, which is in some ways in contrast to his campaign. And really, I think he didn't want a very contentious confirmation battle at a time when we've talked about the prospect of Republicans potentially not having enough votes to confirm someone who would perhaps be a more controversial pick, someone who is going to cause a huge debate, for example, over Roe v. Wade. There isn't as much of a paper trail as we've said on Roe v. Wade for someone like Kavanaugh. He's said in the past that he considers it binding precedent, but that was when he's being considered for the Circuit Court of Appeals. Of course, when you're in that position, you have to follow the precedent set by the Supreme Court. We don't know ultimately whether his opinion might change if he is in the position to reverse that precedent. But he's someone who is supported by the business community as well, but because he is very much a proponent of deregulation. He's authored opinions reining in some of the Obama-era environmental regulations. He He's gone after the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which, of course, came out after the financial collapse. So I think that he's someone who a lot of Republicans would feel is a fairly safe pick. Of course, though, as we've said, we'll see what issues Democrats highlight. I do think, as Caitlin said, they're going to go really hard on this idea that he has said that the president has absolute discretion when it comes to whether or not to appoint or fire a special counsel. With all the attention around the investigation into potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Moscow, I think that might be one of the issues that they really seize upon.
Well, I want to play some of what Brett Kavanaugh had to say about his judicial philosophy. Let's listen to that.
I've served with 17 other judges, each of them a colleague and a friend. My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent.
All right, so Leslie, let me ask you, if you are Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell now and you're thinking about a confirmation process and you look at a Brett Kavanaugh, what are you thinking right now?
He wasn't one of the top two that said would be the safest picks overall. And now you have somebody with over 300, the president talked about over 300 opinions. That's a lot of work, depth to this in terms of navigating it through the Senate. But I think it's still extremely positive. He knows how to do this. He's handled these kind of political battles before. And he's exactly he has the right caliber and enough on the positives to navigate some of these negatives that you're going to see. Those negatives, though, some of these, the amnesty story we're going to hear about, some of these kind of hot issues, I would say they have a lot of light and heat to them, are going to be in the news media. But I think McConnell is going to work the political game of really no highs and lows in the confirmation hearing and get him through.
Yeah, what about that, Caitlin? I mean, we know that Majority Leader McConnell is a sort of master tactician. And we know that Jon Kyl, former Arizona senator, is going to be the Sherpa now guiding Brett Kavanaugh through that confirmation process and meeting with lawmakers, for instance, on Capitol Hill. But when you are considering statements like those from Senator Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski, with this pick of Brett Kavanaugh, are you feeling a little bit better now? If you're Mitch McConnell.
If you're Mitch McConnell, I think so, although there is that, the uncertainty of what you can pick apart from those hundreds of decisions and everything essentially that he has written while on the bench. So since there is a lot to go to, I think that uncertainty is still there. However, I think with this pick, especially opposed to, an Amy Coney Barrett or maybe some others, that this is the more kind of establishment oriented pick. And so I think another thing you have to consider is that while Republicans do have real disagreements with this president on issues like trade, but also on his behavior, on his style, on his rhetoric, they are Republicans at the end of the day. And, Jeff Flake is a good example of this and some others. They eventually do want to get to yes on this pick because this pick, especially in Kavanaugh, is seen as kind of a traditional conservative pick. And so I think that's also how we have to look at this. And that's why I think a lot of these Democrats will be waiting to see what these Republicans do. If Republicans can keep together as a cohesive unit and vote in support of Kavanaugh, you might see that give license to a couple of Democrats to cross over. And if they don't do that, I think that also works to their advantage.
I want to put up a tweet from a Democrat, Senator Doug Jones. This is the statement from the senator there from Alabama. Tonight's announcement is only a first step. A thorough vetting of Judge Kavanaugh's body of work will be critical for the Senate to fulfill its shared responsibility, which I take very seriously. I will be diligent in measuring the record and in undertaking an independent review. So, Sabrina, we've talked about throughout the night the notion of Democrats who find themselves in these positions where they're in these red states, but really we've been focusing on Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly and Joe Manchin. I haven't yet seen what kind of statements they've put out, but we know that they've declined that invitation to be there at the White House for this announcement. Now with this pick of Brett Kavanaugh and so much of a record to go through, is there now perhaps hope that they'll be able to find something within that record, that expansive record, that they will be able to sort of tease out on the issue to maybe hang a position of opposition to, so that they'll be able to say, when it comes to, for instance, Joe Manchin and pre-existing conditions, right, and the issue of health care, some of the rulings that they have seen would give him pause, so that they have a message that in a red state, even as a Democrat, they feel will be able to still connect with voters.
I think quite possibly a lot of it's going to have to do more with workers' rights, health care, some of those economic issues for Democrats who are in red states, because ultimately they're not going to win the public messaging battle when it comes to social issues. I think that's where they actually have to draw a little bit more distance from the broader strategy that might be employed by their colleagues within the Democratic Party. Because he is someone who served within the Bush administration, there might be even perhaps a relitigating of the era, the post 9/11 era, where there was, of course, the question of his role in the enhanced interrogation tactics, and to what extent was he involved in perhaps defending the administration at the time. That was some of what actually came up back when he was initially confirmed to the judiciary. Now, whether or not that a lot of those same issues will be relitigated now remains to be seen. But I think the bottom line is that he is solidly conservative, and some of the legal scholars and political scientists who keep a score of those who sit in the judiciary have said that he would certainly fall well to the right of Anthony Kennedy, whom he would ultimately replace. They're projecting that he would be a conservative second only to Justice Clarence Thomas. So I think that he has a fundamentally conservative record where Democrats will probably be able to tease out something if they want to stand in opposition. And perhaps there's a little bit less pressure on Democrats if they don't feel that they're the decisive vote. If Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski feel they can support someone like Brett Kavanaugh, if he seems less controversial for Republicans, that gives a little bit of cover to those Democrats who don't want to be seen as the deciding vote.
So as you've been speaking, Sabrina, I've just been handed a statement here from Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, and it reads in part, as the senator from West Virginia, I have a constitutional obligation to advise and consent on a nominee to fill Supreme Court vacancies, and I take that responsibility seriously. It goes on to say, the Supreme Court will ultimately decide if nearly 800,000 West Virginians with pre-existing conditions will lose their health care. This decision will directly impact almost 40% of my state, so I'm very interested in his position on protecting West Virginians with pre-existing conditions. So, Joel, the question to you now is, we are already seeing, it would seem, the formulation here of a strategy for those Democrats who are in those red states as they try to figure out how it is that they will approach this particular nomination.
Healthcare is the safe ground for Joe Manchin to be on, and I imagine it's very similar for Joe Donnelly and very similar for Heidi Heitkamp. That's where this is going to be about. I do think you're still going to see people like Joe Manchin wait. They're going to wait to see what happens with Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, but that's the ground they feel safe on pushing back. You're not going to hear Joe Manchin talking about a woman's right. You're not going to hear Joe Manchin talking about some of the other extraneous issues that don't matter to his state. He's somebody who understands home state politics better than anyone in the Democratic caucus, and that's what he's going to do. I will point out one thing. One of my favorite quotes I've heard tonight, Elaine, is an old quote from Dick Durbin, who called Brett Kavanaugh the Forrest Gump of Republican politics. And he called him that because he has essentially been there at every major, kind of watershed moment over the last 20 years. Go back to Bush v. Gore. Go back to Whitewater. Now you look here in the 2000s at some of the very consequential cases we've had come up. I think that's a very interesting framing around Brett Kavanaugh. And actually, Chuck Schumer, in a previous nomination hearing, said that it's salt in the wound for the Democratic base to have somebody like this that they have to consider. So again, these are all of the old statements and all old quotes that are going to come up and are going to become a part of the discussion here. I'm very interested to see how that will play out.
Preview of what's to come. All right, Leslie, Sabrina, Caitlin, and Joel, thanks to you all. Joining me now in Washington is CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. So, Ed, what do you think the biggest obstacles will be here for Kavanaugh in getting confirmed?
Ensuring that he can get all the Republican votes that he can find and that he holds the GOP conference together. If he can do that, it's ball game, basically, because, of course, Republicans control the Senate by 2 votes, or if they need to break a tie, they have Vice President Pence. And so most of the focus in the coming days will begin with Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine. Senator Collins tonight already issuing a statement saying she is going to reserve judgment and looks forward to thoroughly reviewing his record. Keep an eye also on a collection of moderate Democrats. Joe Manchin of West Virginia, as you were talking about, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, and Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota. You read off there just a moment ago the statement from Senator Manchin saying he's going to focus in on health care and whether or not Judge Kavanaugh would sort of essentially preserve the Affordable Care Act. One of the notable rulings that he's made, or votes that he's cast, was in one of the cases regarding the contraceptive mandate of the Affordable Care Act. He said that it violated constitutional rights to religious liberty, and he, among other nominees, had suggested that they didn't like the full scope of it. However, he was among those that sort of went along with John Roberts' theory that the ACA was, in essence, a tax and something that could persevere. So we'll see whether that rattles not only Democrats, but maybe even some conservatives. There are some conservatives who believe that he perhaps wasn't as stridently conservative as they would have liked, but they're on the extremes. So watch those 2 moderate Republicans, watch those 3 moderate Democrats, and then we'll see where it goes from there.
We saw outside of the Supreme Court, ahead of the president's announcement, demonstrators there who were concerned, and in fact, I believe this is a look right now. There you see Senator Bernie Sanders outside of the Supreme Court. But do we know where Brett Kavanaugh stands on the issue of abortion rights?
I don't have it immediately available, but he would not be someone sufficient for this list, because remember, this was a list that was compiled by the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society on behalf of the Trump campaign. Were he to be someone who had in any way sort of ruled in a way that would preserve Roe v. Wade or would even entertain the idea of expanding abortion rights, or at least not trying to restrict them, as conservatives would prefer. I just simply don't have it in front of me, so I can't be certain. But again, he wouldn't have made this list that the president worked off of if he wasn't viewed to be sufficiently sufficient in that regard.
You mentioned Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. As we've been talking about here around the table, they are Republicans, and so is there realistically a sense that there is a danger of them breaking away because of all the choices here? There was a concern that perhaps an Amy Coney Barrett would have been perhaps too much for someone like a Lisa Murkowski or a Susan Collins to contend with. But now, given the fact that it is Brett Kavanaugh, do you think that may, in fact, ease some of that concern?
There's reason to believe it would be easier to win over their support. Where there's going to be trouble now, so based on the assessment of Senate Majority Leader McConnell, among others, to the president over the weekend, is the paper trail that Kavanaugh has. He's been involved in hundreds of decisions, and previous to that dealt with a lot of paperwork during the Bush White House when he served as a staff secretary. The staff secretary is literally the person that controls the paper flow to the desk in the Oval Office. That doesn't mean he wrote the paperwork that is handed to the president, but he would have reviewed it or would have handled it one time or another. And so there are going to undoubtedly be attempts by Democrats to draw questions about what did he know about early Bush-era policy, especially after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, when he was still in that position. You heard him say there in his introductory remarks that he worked at the White House and was there on 9/11. He would have been, because this was someone who handled the paper flow. And so Democrats are expected to try to seize on that, and if not derail the nomination, certainly prolong it and force a vote later in the timetable than Republicans would prefer. The other thing, too, is that, remember, he was, as we've talked about, a member of the Ken Starr investigative team during the Clinton impeachment. What, if anything, from that experience might reflect upon what's going on right now with President Trump, given that there is a special counsel, just as Ken Starr was, investigating the current president? Will he be asked to comment on that? Will it be relevant at all? Or will it be seen as out of bounds by his Republican supporters? So there's a lot to work with here. One observation I would make, Elaine, there's no doubt that he is a experienced judicial mind. No doubt that he checks a lot of boxes for conservatives. You saw him and his supporters almost immediately embrace the fact that he's a family man, has 2 young daughters, is very active in their lives, and is very active in his community. But he does nothing to fulfill the president's vow to drain the swamp. This is someone who was born and raised in Washington, has built a professional career in Washington, met his wife while working at the White House, and goes to, and whose wife is on the town council of Chevy Chase, which is a community just outside Washington, probably, if not in the swamp, certainly adjoins the swamp in the eyes of people who have issues with Washington and the establishment or elitist culture that they believe it espouses. So that's an interesting, thing. We know at one point or another he was looking at nominees who were not educated at Harvard or Yale. Kavanaugh was, and so in that regard, at least, that is a departure perhaps from Trump's other vows. But undoubtedly, conservatives will be happy with this pick. Most Democrats and liberals will be furious about it. And ultimately, just keep your eye on the ball. Can he get to at least 50 votes? Can he hold the Republican conference together? And if he does, that's game, set, match. This thing is going to a confirmation vote, and he'll be on the court by the fall.
All right. Ed O'Keefe in Washington for us. Ed, thanks so much. Let's head to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue now, the North Lawn, and CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Jiang there. So, Weijia, you were in the East Room for President Trump's announcement. Tell us about what that mood was like and what you saw.
Well, certainly the energy had been building, Elaine, all day long, actually for days. And as the president walked out, he really was beaming because he understands how important this decision is. It's a defining moment of his presidency. He had been teasing it all week long in tweets, anytime he could speak out in public. And this was really important to him. And I think that because of that, until the words Judge Brett Kavanaugh left his lips, he took great efforts to keep that name sealed because he did not want any leak to sort of damper his moment, his night. Not that it was a surprise. As you've been talking about all night, this on paper makes perfect sense for President Trump to choose Judge Kavanaugh. He had the credentials, the pedigree, the experience that he so admires. But on the other hand, you never know with President Trump. And even if someone has everything on a resume that looks good, if he doesn't have chemistry or connect with a person, you don't know exactly how he might choose, not to mention all the directions he was being pulled. But one thing we saw very clearly tonight in the East Room was the person who Judge Kavanaugh is, right? And that might have been by design. His family was right next to him. He looked out to his parents who were sitting next to First Lady Melania Trump. His wife and 2 young daughters were next to him. And he talked about them a lot. He talked about how much he loved his family, how he loved being a father, and even gave a low 5 to his youngest daughter, talked about his other daughter's softball championship, and he happens to coach their team. And so he was able to present a different picture than what we've been reporting, which is basically all of his credentials, right? And so we know that President Trump values this. And when he feels that chemistry with someone, when he sees that someone is a family man, as he has talked about in the past, he appreciates that. All that being said, as Ed was just talking about, this is going to be a grueling process to get him confirmed. And the White House is well aware of that. In fact, sources here told us they were prepared with 4 different rollout plans because there were 4 potential candidates on the president's short list. And they were ready to go because they knew as soon as that name was announced, they were on a mission to try to get this person confirmed. So they're already at work. The team is led by White House counsel Don McGahn, who played the same role when Justice Neil Gorsuch was nominated. So they're well aware of the work ahead of them. But as for tonight, it was a tremendous moment for President Trump, his now 2nd nominee. And it's really a campaign promise filled.
All right, Weijia Jiang at the White House for us. Weijia, thank you. Joining me now for more analysis is Jesse Weber. He's an attorney and host at the Law and Crime Network. And Jessica Levinson is a Loyola law professor and joins us now from Los Angeles. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Jesse. How different is Judge Kavanaugh from President Trump's first Supreme Court pick, Neil Gorsuch?
It's not just a difference. I mean, they have a similarity in education and pedigree and credentials, and that's all great. But the impact of this decision is really what makes this so different. This man is going to be scrutinized, and we talked about it, over 300 opinions. The homework that is going to have to be done by the senators and their clerks is not an easy task and not a fun task. Every word, every decision will be grilled. Now, his record is a little bit different than Gorsuch. He came from a very different background. He served on the D.C. Court of Appeals. He worked he was a staff secretary to George Bush. His background is different, and that is all important moving forward. I think the words that he delivered tonight were very different than what Gorsuch delivered. Did you hear the flavor of women, women, women? It's because of the elephant in the room with Roe v. Wade. He's very strategic. And by the way, this is the first time many people have ever heard him speak. It gives you an idea of how strategic he might be when he ultimately comes to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, let me ask you, Jessica, I mean, what did you hear in the remarks from Judge Kavanaugh tonight?
I heard him filling out his autobiography. I heard him telling us something about himself. I heard him talking about his parents. I heard him talking about the importance of public service, of family. He talked about the older generation, the younger generation. He praised his wife. I think a lot of what he was doing tonight was introducing himself to the American public as someone who is likable, who cares about what they care about. And I think that what he was really doing is saying, there's no reason to be worried about me if you are to the left of the aisle. I'm a very reasonable person, and we can identify with each other. And in a lot of ways, it was the way a politician might introduce themselves to the American public, saying, we all have parents we care about. Here's how I met my wife. Here's a little something about my family. I'm hugely humbled to be here. So again, I think a lot of tonight was really biographical sketches.
Yeah, and Jessica, I thought it was interesting as well. He mentioned Justice Elena Kagan in his remarks, which is not necessarily something I was expecting.
And certainly not this didn't happen just by accident. So he mentioned